In the first half of November, thousands of delegates from almost 200 nations will gather in the Egyptian resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh for the 27th edition of the Conference of the Parties, or COP27 for short. For nearly 3 decades, nations have been gathering annually in the hope of slowing the pace of climate change and discussing, or more often arguing, over ways to drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions. This is not easy thanks to the world's continued reliance on fossil fuels, and fossil fuels, of course, is a big, influential business. But to understand the situation, let us go back to the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, where it all began. 30 years ago, scientists were already warning of the growing threat from greenhouse gases, mainly from burning fossil fuel. So at Rio, world leaders backed the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, the first global effort to tackle climate change. The convention's key aim is to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system and to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. The first COP meeting took place in Berlin in 1995. COP1, as it was called, set in train formal discussions to create the world's first climate treaty called the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997 and eventually came into force in 2005. Kyoto put the onus on rich nations to take the lead on emissions cuts. But developing nations' emissions were growing rapidly, and the United States never ratified Kyoto. So a new deal was needed. Fast forward to 2015, and the new global deal finally came together at COP21 when nations backed the Paris Agreement. The pact obliges all nations to take steps to reduce emissions. So every 5 years, these steps must become progressively more ambitious, and all nations must regularly report on their efforts and have these verified. Nations also agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and, ideally, 1.5 degrees, compared to pre-industrial levels, and to achieve a climate-neutral world by mid-century. However, although the Paris Agreement was adopted and entered into force in 2016, nations had yet to agree on all the mechanisms to put it into action. So finally, at COP26 in the Scottish city of Glasgow in 2021, nations agreed the final elements of the Paris Rulebook, as it was called. The agreement on the final rulebook elements forms part of the Glasgow Climate Pact, which includes the architecture of carbon markets, which could unlock billions of dollars in climate investments. So recognizing that global emissions are still rising and current global efforts to fight climate change are not enough, the Glasgow Pact also asked all nations to strengthen their 2030 emissions goals by COP27 in Egypt this year. So COP27's main focus will be in finance. So this is money for developing and poorer nations to accelerate investments in cutting emissions, for adaptation and funding loss and damage to cope with worsening climate impacts. The money is needed to fully implement the Paris Agreement, and African nations will be pushing rich nations to finally come up with the cash. And if richer nations don't agree, COP27 could be a flop. And that's really bad news because global greenhouse gas emissions are still growing. For more on COP27, follow our coverage at thestraitstimes.com/climate change.